What is up, denizens of the interwebs? It's Chats here, back to talk about the greatest video game ever made. That's right, we're talking Concord. So, like, subscribe, and hop in, losers. This mess just keeps getting better. There are only really two major pieces of information to come out about Concord recently. Both of them I'm going to be getting from bounding into the comics, from articles written by Spencer Bakuli. And the first one is, Concord director reportedly steps down following game's failure. Fellow Firewalk Studio devs presume mass layoffs inbound. According to this article, the lead developer of Concord, Ryan Ellis, who per gosh was the main shot caller on the failed hero shooter, told his fellow devs that he would be stepping down from his leadership role in favor of a more support-oriented role. So of course, like how it usually goes when someone fails in these major industries, is instead of being gotten rid of like they should be, they get put into a support role so that in the future they can fail upwards, or if they never go up, they still stay at the same level they were when they committed the failure. They never actually receive any penalty for failing in such a phenomenal fashion. But Cooley then reminds us of this nice little message that we had gotten from Ellis. Notably, players may remember that in his last official communication as the game's director, Ellis assured the public that although the Concord had been essentially scrapped in its current state, he and his team at Firewalk Studios were still working to both explore options for the game, including those that would better reach our players, and determine the best path ahead. Of course, that means that he's implying that they're going to move to a free-to-play model, similar to that of Overwatch 2, Apex Legends, and Marvel Rivals. However, the insider that Bakuli's article is referencing says that it is looking completely unlikely, but so is their continued employment, theirs being the people at Firewalk Studios, the company behind. And that's pretty much all there is coming from this article. It just really looks like Firewalk Studios is likely to be shut down. After Sony spent so much money to first acquire the studio and then spent so much money to develop Concord, I sincerely doubt they're looking to keep on such a massive failure that has cost them this much money. They might do that, but it would be absolutely ludicrous and completely insane for them to do that when they could take the money and use it to support other studios, such as the studio behind Astrobot. And so of course that leads me over to this other article from Bounding into the Comics by Spencer Bakuli. Concord dev allegedly reveals the failed game cost $400 million to make, says it was referred to internally as a Star Wars-like project for Sony. And what's absolutely insane about that is just how much it blows out of the waters everyone's previous assumptions. Everyone, including myself, was under the impression that Concord was a $200 million game, as is pretty standard for AAA games. And based on the way that other previous Sony titles had cost, such as Ghost of Tsushima, which had an estimated budget of $60 million, it is absolutely absurd to think that this game not only exceeded that, but doubled our expectations. And this information is coming from a podcast where a man had spoken in confidentiality with one of the devs of Concord and released a bunch of information about the game, such as that not only was the failed hero shooter far and wide Sony's most expensive title to date, but that it was considered by higher-ups to be the future of the PlayStation brand's entire operations. That they thought this was going to be a multimedia brand that was going to impact every single thing. Like they have the Secret Level, a TV show, I assume they had planned many more TV shows. And I assume they had planned to do multiple spin-off games similar to how League of Legends has it, where they have a whole slew of games, from 2D Metroidvanias to fighting games, even their own TCG. The leak continues that reportedly $200 million was put into the alpha state of Concord alone. You know, the very bare bones, this is the basic thing. It's not pretty, it doesn't look good, it doesn't play well, but it's barely functional and it's a proof of concept. The fact that the proof of concept costs over $200 million to make and required an additional $200 million to develop is absolutely insane that PlayStation first of all thought it was a good idea to continue with it, instead of shelving it and taking the write-off, or using the assets to make something a little bit better that would guarantee refund. And then he goes on to say, the scuttlebutt behind the scenes about Concord is that the game was in laughable shape when it was shown, which I don't know what he means by laughable state when it was shown. It's in laughable state now. Well, it was in laughable state before they shut the servers down, and now it's in an hysterical state. The fact that they honestly spent $400 million on this game is just absolutely baffling to me. This has to be a money laundering scheme at its finest. And the whistleblower continues to note that the game didn't cost $200 million to be playable, it cost $200 million to be viable, that it cost $200 million for the game to barely boot up, barely play, and barely run, and they thought, yeah, that's a great idea. Something so bloated and expensive obviously needs twice as much so that we can get it to be playable, if the fact that $200 million wasn't enough. And of course, this just goes to show that this is the biggest game Sony has ever released from a budgetary standpoint, which is absolutely insane to think about that they spent that. And just to be clear, for $400,000, because this is the greatest metric of success, you could have funded 27 to 40 different Godzilla minus ones for the cost it costs to make Concord. Godzilla minus one being one of the greatest movies I've ever seen, and Concord being, well, the greatest video game I've ever bought. And even crazier is that Sony legitimately thought that Concord was the future of PlayStation, and they had internally referred to it as Star Wars-like project for Sony, which is what I was talking about with the multimedia aims, which makes complete sense when you think about the sheer number of investment. It would almost be idiotic to conceive of a world where they wouldn't try to branch it onto other projects and try to recoup a little bit of that cost. But of course, the game doesn't have microtransactions. How did Sony think that it was possible that anyone would be willing to spend $400 million for Concord? Which of course means that they would have had to sell 10 million copies just to break even on the game, not including things like vendor cuts and physical printing costs. The fact that they thought that they were going to find any way to break even on this game is absolutely insane without the inclusion of microtransactions. And this 100% also goes to show why I have zero hope that they would ever turn this into a free-to-play game, because why would they? They've already spent $400 million on development, and they would have to spend a significant amount more if they were to try to turn this into a single-player game through development costs, new skins, and finding a new way to monetize the game, given how saturated the market is for monetized single-player shooters. And of course, any time that they might be able to release this as a single-player game, they will be competing with Marvel Rivals, which, if you recall the SteamDB numbers for the betas that were happening at the same time, Concord's open beta was at 2,000 players, whereas Marvel Rivals was at 50,000 players. And I can tell you, Marvel Rivals is the far superior game. It is one of the best hero shooters I've ever played, and feels almost as good, if not better, than OG Overwatch. Now, there was some other information that had come out from that podcast link that is not mentioned in any bounding into the comics article, in that the culture around Concord, which is one of toxic positivity, which is of absolutely no shock when you take a look at some of the character designs, and that is even strengthened when you think about the claim that the characters were done by committee. So in a system where characters are done by committee and there's a culture of toxic positivity where the idea of saying no is worse than giving a bad idea, it's completely not shocking how, first of all, the budget ballooned, and second of all, how the project looked this bad. Now, when it comes to the character designs, I have discovered one account that I want to give a shout out to. I know he has infinitely more subscribers than I do, and that's fine, but I do love his content. As you can see, I've watched most of his videos. He does a lot of videos breaking down and correcting the designs of Concord characters, and honestly, they all look really good. He also worked on Injustice Gods Among Us, the comic book, which is one of my favorite comics, aside from the fact that Tom Taylor wrote it, and makes me feel infinitely better about reading said comic books. And he worked on Deus Ex, which is one of my favorite game franchises. This guy has done amazing work in his past, and his videos are doing amazing work correcting the Concord designs. And two of his favorite designs that he's done so far, hopefully he doesn't mind the fact that I'm showing the end product, is this one for the Duchess, which honestly, this is one of my favorite designs for a hero shooter character I've ever seen. I would love to play this. Ana was one of my favorite characters in Overwatch 1, and this looks like a character who'd be very similar, and I think the design is just phenomenal. And there's also this one, which takes the core of that horribly ugly fat character with the pants over his stomach, and maintains the core of that, the bulky appearance and the role of the character, and actually makes the role clear. If you had shown me that fat guy, looking at this guy, I would never have guessed he was a medic. I was honestly shocked when Blacklist University had told me that he was in fact a medic. So, if you like my content at all, and you're a fan of art, I would recommend you go and check out Blacklist Universe, especially his Concord videos. They are truly amazingly done, and I will be continuing to watch them for a very long time. So to me, it's really not at all surprising that Concord ended up the way it did. With the ballooning budget, the absolutely hideous characters, the character design by committee, and the fact that they suffered from a culture of toxic positivity, it makes everything abundantly clear, and I really think this is the epitome of the wokeism on video game development. This is what happens when you bring someone in like Sweet Baby Inc., or where you have leftist politics so heavily ingrained in your company. You get something that is completely out of control and just looks and plays bad. Hopefully, the gaming industry learned from this. Hopefully, PlayStation learns from this. Hopefully, culture learns from this, because I am tired of getting bad stuff. And understand, the problem with the woke is that it's bad. There are many woke things that I've enjoyed because they were good, for instance, the first 2 seasons of Sabrina and the first 3 seasons of The Boys. But after that, they let the wokeism just get too dominant, and that's why it all failed. If The Acolyte wasn't bad, no one would really care that it was woke other than a handful of Star Wars people. I would imagine that even Star Wars Theory would not have had an issue with it if it wasn't for the fact that it's just bad content. So let me know if you find it all surprising if the budget for Concord got this big, and let me know if you think we're going to see a similar budget problem with Dragon Age the Veilguard. And thanks for coming along and just continuing to deal with this bullshit.